The fringe trans movement, the progressive trans movement, with the concern you just brought up, their message to you has frankly been shut the hell up.
I should have the right to wear what I want to wear, and you should have the right to not respect my pronouns, right? And say what you want to say.
It is making Taf and I so much more unsafe what this progressive fringe is doing, because it is turning our existence into a culture war.
What are trans rights? Just asking questions. I'm Zach Weissmuller, Reason Senior Producer, joined by my co-host, Liz Wolfe, Reason Associate Editor and author of the Reason Roundup. Hey, Liz.
Hey, Zach.
So before we get into the conversation, we're still in the early days of our newly spun off YouTube channel. So please subscribe there if you haven't yet. It'd really help us out and hopefully help you to get notified when we put up new clips or episodes. Now, about 0.5% of US adults identify as transgender as of a 2022 UCLA study. That number might be somewhat in flux. The same study found that among 13 and 17-year-olds, it's grown to about 1.5%. That uptick in the youth might help explain why trans issues have played an increasingly large role in American politics. Registered voters told Gallup pollsters it was actually among the least important political issues they considered when weighing their presidential vote, just below climate change. And yet, the Trump campaign spent $65 million running ads in swing states attacking Kamala Harris's transgender policy stances in the final stretch of the campaign, according to the New York Times. The top Harris super PAC found that one such ad shifted voters who viewed it almost 3 points towards Trump, and then it resonated particularly well among demographics that shifted significantly in Trump's direction. In a relatively close election, is it possible this actually was a deciding factor? And how should trans advocates and Democrats adjust their approach to this issue? Joining us today to talk about it are Brianna Wu and TafTaj. They are two of the co-hosts of the new show Dollcast, a show about transgender issues and politics, acting as a corrective to what they see as some of the excesses or errors of the trans and gender critical movements. TafTaj is a streamer and commentator. Wu is a political activist, Democratic operative, and commentator, perhaps best known for her involvement in Gamergate. She now runs the Progressive Rebellion PAC. Thank you both for joining us today.
It's such
Great
an
to be
honor.
here.
I'm such a huge fan of your work. I did election night with Barry Weiss and the Free Press people, and it feels like, what she's described as this great scramble. And I think it's so interesting that people like me that believe in progressive principles, but think these progressive tactics are a dead end to get there. I am now more aligned with you than I am the fringe of the Democratic Party. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the next 4 years as we find a way to work together.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I want to start by asking you a little bit about that political evolution. You, as we mentioned in the intro there, went to war with the alt-right. Remember them? Back when you were fighting them, about video games. Now it seems like you're just as likely to get in fights with the progressive left. What happened?
Yeah. October 7th happened. I suspect that Reason and your listeners might be a little bit little bit more suspicious about American foreign policy than I am. I grew up in a military family. And I think it's entirely reasonable that countries have to defend themselves. This is why Robert A. Heinlein, one of the founders of libertarian thought, is one of my very favorite authors. This twist around to turn the victims of October 7th into the perpetrators of a genocide. It is horse duty. I don't know a language I can use on here, but it just doesn't seem correct to me. And seeing my own side just go full on anti-Semite, it's like, look, I've been willing to be quiet over the last 10 years as we've descended into some silliness on some things. I am not prepared to pretend go full on anti-Semite and pretend like my Jewish friends and neighbors are the enemy of the country. So that was my hard break. And I found once I started telling the truth, I just simply could not stop.
Did it start before that though? Were there signs before all of that happened? Because that's a relatively recent evolution.
Well, I will tell you the truth, and this is embarrassing for me, but over the last 10 years, yeah, I built up a certain amount of power in progressive world. And the thing about progressive world is it will treat you as a friend, and you'll get wonderful media opportunities with the New York Times and, all these great places. But if you adhere to a very, like, set of beliefs, right? So, as the things Taff and I agree on, like, she's been talking up these dangers of, affirming everyone in the trans community for what, Taff, 5 years? You've had more bravery than I have, because I just kept my mouth shut and pretended this wasn't a problem to go along. So, it is a increasing break with reality, I felt, with the progressive side, and now it is at such a point that it's literally getting Donald Trump elected, and I think it's
Mm.
time for people that believe in free speech and, our national ideals to stand up.
You wrote recently in the Boston Globe about this problem of the progressive purity spiral. Do you want to explain what that is and what it felt like being sort of trapped in that?
Yeah. So the problem with the with progressive ideas is there's no way to put a brake on bad ideas. So let's take one very concrete one, police violence. I think all of us saw, Black Lives Matter and some of the violence that happened with police. Yeah, I think all of us realized, like, it's reasonable to have a national conversation about police violence, right? The problem is with the progressive world, you then have to subscribe to an ever leftward increasing set of ideals, where it's not enough to say, like, we need police reform. You have to then subscribe to, let's defund all the police in the United States, which is then kind of crazy. So, you're so punished for going against any part of this idealism, that you're really incentivized to keep your mouth shut. A really good example, Taffeta. Like, both of us had medically transitioned, but we have felt like we couldn't speak our mind on, this non-binary or this overly affirming trend in the trans movement, because it's progressive idea capture there.
Hmm. Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit in a second, but let me get Taff in here first because my understanding of you, just based on your presence on X, is that you're a little bit more in the right wing camp, or or have been more in the right leaning camp. And yet now, which first of all might surprise some people about a trans person. But secondly, you're now doing a show with Brianna Wu. How have your politics shifted and changed in the last several years, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I started out like, I was 13 years old and I annoyed my mother constantly trying to debate her about her religion. And she like convinced me to get a philosophy tutor. And he like gave me Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. So I
Mm.
started from like a very libertarian perspective. And I've always been extremely interested in just exploring any idea. And that kind of I ended up in a kind of libertarian-ish, worldview. I've explored lots of more right-wing thinkers like James Burnham or Curtis Yarvin, Hoppe even, and I've always been a little bit more on the right-wing side of things, but my experience expressing viewpoints to conservatives was that oftentimes it was easy to pigeonhole myself as kind of someone who, just tokenizes the trans community and offers like a mouthpiece to, be like quote unquote one of the good ones. And I hated that. So I've been banging the drum for a long time about some of the failures that I saw within the trans movement. For example, I think that the evidence for some of our gender affirming care is a lot weaker than people realize. And it really does not benefit us as a community to insist upon, you know, something that just isn't real, right? That, like, we are insisting that we have all of this evidence for really pernicious effects that we just don't have. And ultimately, a lot of those things are going to come to light and hurt us. But in my time expressing those viewpoints, I realized that, I wasn't really getting anywhere with the conservatives. And so now I've moved more towards the progressive end, where I'm much more interested in advocating for trans people in a way that is very genuine and is not giving ground to people who ultimately hate us.
So, yeah, I mean, it seems like you've both kind of been pulled. Maybe you're both centrists now. I mean, I don't know. I saw a tweet that you put out, Brianna, where you actually were making kind of like this. You're like, we need to have a centrist case for, trans rights. And you posted this graph, which shows that, the median Democratic political influencer, their politics are far to the left of kind of just the average voter. And then at the bottom here, you see the median Republican political influencer, and they're a little bit to the right, but not far to the right. So they're much more in sync. And your conclusion here is that anyone serious about policies like trans rights needs to make that case from the center. So, what is the centrist case for trans rights, and how does it look different than how activists talk about it right now?
Oh my God, Zach, thank you so much for asking this because it's the most important question. The truth is, my trans activist friends that showed up 5 minutes ago, they don't understand. Trans expansion of rights has always come from the center. It has never come from the fringe. So, the most important event to happen in trans access to the public square happened in 1979. Dr. Harry Benjamin put out what is called the Standards of Care. And it was a document talking up the procedure people like Taff and I have to go through to basically legally and socially transition genders. It involves things like going to a therapist for 3 months, a certified therapist, getting a letter certifying that we have gender dysphoria according to the clinical criteria, then getting on HRT. And then as you move along and you're socialized into the gender you want to move into, then new things open up like access to surgery, access to hormones. So it was a pathway that we could go down. And what was really interesting, if you go back through and read the 1997 document on, like clinician's guide to changing genders that I did it under, it is remarkably thoughtful in how you balance competing interests. Let's be very clear. Biological women have a stake. And this is a lot different than, say, a Black person trying to live in a white neighborhood. There's no public policy stake with valid concerns there. Women, biological women, do have a reasonable concern about sexual predators being in their bathroom. And the brilliance of the Harry Benjamin protocols is it would not let you do that until you'd gone through and taken anti-androgen. There was a set of steps that you had to go through, very much in the middle, getting buy-in from the right and the left. Because let's be really honest, the strongest argument for trans people has always, always been the libertarian one. To quote a brilliant philosopher who's sitting right next to me, I don't need you to believe like some esoteric philosophical ideal that I'm a woman. I just need you to let me have autonomy over my own body. So, me going to a doctor, getting something that gives me medical help with something, that works. What doesn't work is going into the public commons and trying to fire people that get pronouns wrong or trying to silence people that have reasonable questions about children being exposed to gender ideology or trying to give kindergartners forms to say, let's really interrogate this. Maybe you're non binary. Um, None of this is reasonable. And the trans public policy playbook has been to shut it down. It is a document and it is an ideology that is about conquering gender norms rather than coexisting and is the dead wrong tactic here.
I totally get what you're saying, and I think it makes a lot of sense. It strikes me as very moderate and very sort of like regimented and standardized, which makes a lot of sense. But I would push back on something you said, which was that you don't need philosophical that libertarianism is strong here because you don't need philosophical buy-in from all, affected parties or from all members of society. What you really need is merely a respect for bodily autonomy. But to some degree, you also do need biological women to have some amount of philosophical buy-in in order to honor the transition and allow trans women into the spaces of women, right?
I agree. Well, the
So
spaces
it's
I
both
am most
and, you know?
sure. I want to be really clear. The only space I am really focused on having access to is the bathroom. Like that's a public policy issue. Yeah, I don't think I grew up in Mississippi. It does not make sense to me to recreate the segregationist policies of the 1960s South here. I think if someone is on a medical pathway meaning they've got documents from a clinician saying they have gender dysphoria. They've been on anti-androgens, which inhibit erections. I think at this point, if someone is making a genuine effort to move forward in society and integrate, you're right. We do need, like, coexistence requires compromise. But, I think it's this playbook that the trans branch has had of trying to silence these fears and to conquer these fears and to literally tell biological women, if you see a penis in a locker room at a spa or a gym, that you need to shut up because you're a bigot. That's just insane. That is literally insane. So I think a more tempered approach here is the way forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I do want to take us to what was ultimately a very effective uh, attack ad from the Trump campaign to the Harris campaign this election cycle. I'm sure you guys are both familiar with this, but it was the Kamala Harris is for they them, Donald Trump is for you ad. John, can we roll that one?
Kamala supports taxpayer-funded sex changes for prisoners.
Surgery
For prisoners.
for prisoners. Every transgender inmate in the prison system would have access.
Hell no, I don't want my taxpayer dollars going to that.
Kamala supports transgender sex changes in jail with our money.
Kamala even supports letting biological men compete against our girls in their sports. Kamala is for they, them. President Trump is for you.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
I mean, this was kind of an insane ad because, I mean, talk about an issue that really doesn't super. I mean, it's something that strikes fear in the hearts of many people, struggling to make ends meet in middle America. But by and large, like, this is not like this is not related to kitchen table issues. This is not inflation. This is not border crisis. This is something where I believe the Bureau of Prisons had what, two different sex changes that they approved over the last few years. This is not something affecting a huge number of people, and yet this ad was very salient. What did you guys make of it? What was your reaction upon seeing it? And do you think it makes sense for this to become something that's used in presidential elections to this degree?
I mean, unfortunately, I think it's inevitable. Americans are extremely lenient when it comes to personal freedom in so many ways. There are people who get, like, their fingers cut off or their eyeballs are tattooed black. And Americans will find that, like, distasteful. They won't like it, but it's not something that people end up running presidential campaigns on. And you turn on the TV, you could watch Botched. People have an incredible amount of personal freedom to modify their bodies as they want. And Americans, by and large, wouldn't want it for themselves. But again, not a political issue. I think it becomes a political issue when it enters into this public arena. So I think what people see are they see the government taking a stance on a social issue and saying, we actually want, or we want to encourage people to be able to make these transitions. And we want to enable them to have these surgeries. And so then we are involving, like, the American public. So personal liberty argument, very strong. Americans are sensitive to it. But the reality is there are so many areas in the public sphere where the government has taken a strong stance, often, I think, stronger than is necessary or warranted by the data. And it's because we have this political climate where people don't feel comfortable to speak out against some of the excesses. Then you're not progressive, you're a bigot, whatever it is. And that has just been ratcheted up for the past 10 years. And suddenly we're in a world where things are happening, we're teaching gender stuff to, like, kindergarteners, and there really isn't a good reason for it. And I think parents are mad. And I've been telling the trans community over and over, this isn't working, and it's really frustrating to see the Democrats fail to listen to that.
Could you give an
I fully
example
agree.
of could you give an example of a case where you feel that the government has been promoting weak data or something that's just not supportable by the evidence?
Oh my God, here's a
Oh, go ahead,
perfect
Brianna.
example with this. Oh, this is really good. So one of the things that's happened is between the DSM that I transitioned on, which was the DSM-4, is ideologues captured the transgender movement, and now the DSM-5 has ratcheted down all the criteria to give you gender dysphoria and included all this non-binary stuff. Now, look, I want to be really clear. If you're a non-binary person, I will do my best to respect you. I will call you whatever pronouns you want. I believe you're going through something. But the truth is, they've colonized our medical condition, and as a public policy matter, as far as insurance paying for all this stuff, it is now conflated. So you literally have non-binary people with a beard that want to get breast implants that
Mhm.
are using this insane set of criteria in this ideologically captured mental health model now, and they're making everyone's healthcare costs go up. So this self ID expansion of what trans means, it is not serving the community. Trans women need medical safeguarding. If I am going to a doctor and saying, I think I have gender dysphoria, we deserve a healthcare system that is going to interrogate that and really examine if this radical thing that you're doing to your body and your endocrinology system and your social life, if this is really going to benefit you. I want to be clear. I transitioned over 20 years ago. I've never regretted it for a second. I went from a drug addicted, shut in who could not socially function to my career today. It has led to financial security, a very successful career, a marriage for 16 years and counting to a wonderful man. But that doesn't mean what worked for me is working for this radical expansion. And just one more thing, Zach, you
Yeah.
mentioned this stat at the top of this show saying, what was it, 6% of people identify as gay today or trans. What was that stat again?
Well, no, it was like 0.5%. I can bring up the
Point
slide.
5, it was 0.5%. Years ago, when I transitioned, that number was 0.5%. Today, according to NBC News, I looked at this just yesterday, 5% of children under the age of 18 are identifying as transgender. So there's
Mm.
a 4,700% increase. This isn't
Oh,
just wider social acceptance. This is an entirely new cohort.
yeah, let me just bring up this chart real quick, because this is from the CAS review, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more in a second. But they were drawing this data from Jean Twenge's study, and what she found is that this graph on the left here shows the generation gap. Transgenders on the left here, so you see a huge spike, about upwards of about 3% of female to male transgender among Gen Z. And then the second graph, it's even higher. It's coming up on 4% when you talk about non-binary. Yeah, could you talk a little bit about just talk a little bit more about the sort of non-binary versus trans distinction, because this actually seems like an interesting like there's a cleaving happening here between, or a fracturing happening in the movement between these two groups. What is the importance of that?
Well, oh, I would love to talk about this as well because, like Brianna, I am very much in favor of the freedom for non binary people to present as they want and to ask people to use whatever pronouns they feel comfortable with. I'm totally in favor of that. What I think is happening here is we're sort of conflating two different things, and that is like a lifestyle minority and like a medical minority, right? And these groups have different kinds of public policy that needs to be applied to them and medical policy that needs to be applied to them. So for someone like, for someone who's non-binary, for whom their trans identity is maybe a little bit more of a lifestyle thing, they might not necessarily need the same level of medical intervention as someone who has a long track record of persistent and intense gender dysphoria. Now,
What
we're
do you
talking
mean
about
when you say lifestyle? I don't understand.
yeah, so I mean, sometimes people they'll be non-binary and they will change their clothes. They'll maybe like wear makeup if they are natal male. They'll change their name, but ultimately they don't pursue medical transition, or if they do, it's only to a very limited extent, or so they might get like laser hair removal on their face. These are all personal aesthetic choices that may or may not speak to a deeper innate condition, underlying biological reality in the brain. And so it seems like now again, we'll talk more about this. it seems like there are some people who have a real persistent negative psychological disposition, and that results from them not being able to transition or take hormones. And that resolves when they begin that medical journey. And so it's important that we're able to distinguish between people who are going to benefit from hormones and people who aren't. And I think that's what Brianna Wu is getting at.
100%. And the problem is it does not serve a non-binary, which, to be clear, a lot of this non-binary trending is with natal females. It does not serve these natal females to tell them that being non-binary or transitioning is going to solve all of their problems. Taff and I on Dollcast talk every single week about this false hope that a lot of trans people have, that just getting on HRT is going to solve everything for you. My life is much better overall because I've transitioned, but it has been extraordinarily difficult as well. And, I think the reality is the culture that has been pushed by the progressive fringe is making transition a first option and not a last option. It is we're medicalizing far too many of these kids, particularly. And it makes this wider argument for my healthcare so much harder when pedestrian, ordinary gender nonconformity is being conflated with something that is just it's a very different beast.
But how can we sufficiently judge from the outside the, like, validity of their claims? Because it feels like the argument that you're making is it makes a lot of sense, like, it logically follows where it's like, okay, we shouldn't give people false hope that a specific medicine will, resolve some of the deep inner turmoil that they're feeling or some of the confusion that they're feeling. That is wrong, that's not our dishonesty in this realm is actually doing a huge disservice to them. That all makes sense. But how can we externally adjudicate, the legitimacy of their claim, right? Because this is the exact same type of argument that people use toward, trans people, right?
Yeah,
Thank you for
absolutely.
asking. This is a great question. So symptomology drives treatment. So there are symptoms in the DSM. Now, when I transitioned 20 years ago, I had 6 out of 6 of these symptoms for gender dysphoria. If you literally type into ChatGPT, give me the most typical case study of a child with gender dysphoria, it's literally my life story. You know exactly what that looks like. The problem is the standards have been lowered by activists. Today, you only need two, two of those criteria, and they've been rewritten in ways to just widen to ordinary gender nonconformity or create your own gender, of which there's no data to support this. So the way you differentiate this is with science. And it's only the people with the highest level of clinical distress and comorbidities that are not getting in the way. That is how you know. If I personally had a teenage daughter who was on the autism spectrum and was underage and was telling me she wanted to transition, I would be 2 billion out of 20 suspicious of that and would probably not sign off on it until she was 18, especially if she was only giving me a few symptoms. That we're in this race to affirm everyone, we are letting people be medicalized who it does not serve.
Which is unfortunate. And that's how you end up with these detransition stories, which are really quite tragic. At the end of the day, as long as medical experts are getting involved, you are going to have some false positives and false negatives. That is something that we have to acknowledge and deal with. But I think at this point, it's a matter of minimizing those tragic outcomes. And the way you do that is, with serious interrogation rather than just like checking off everyone who comes in. Again, I think there needs to be a very different standard for adults and children. Adults, I think you should have much more leeway with what you do with your body. But when it comes to children, we can't expect them necessarily to have all the knowledge to consent to such a procedure. And so there really needs to be a very strict standard for how those children start the medical pathway, if they do at all.
Do you mind if I ask you both a little bit about your personal experiences? Because Brianna, you mentioned that you feel that transitioning made your life better. In what way?
Well, so I started off like my earliest memory of realizing I was trans. I was like 3 years old. This is a lifelong bone deep feeling that I was a girl and just a lifelong attraction to all of that kind of stuff. Like when I hit puberty, I wanted a boyfriend. And this cost of keeping a mask on all the time and hiding what I was thinking and feeling, it really, really took an extreme toll on me. I literally cannot function. I could not function going through life as a man. And, the second I could express myself to the world in a way that felt natural, my life just instantly improved. HRT fixed my brain instantly. It was a miracle drug. I could not feel emotions. I could not like interact with people socially before that. And then everything made sense. It was night and day. So, I would just say, look at my life before and after. Drug addicted, shut in, rehab, like just an absolute mess who could not like manage to get to college classes to literally in a few years a national figure, running for Congress and I think doing really important work. There's no doubt this has made my life better. It's also true that I have the most like classical case you could probably have of being transgender. And, again, I think when we get down to these complications, if someone is, say, has a history of cross dressing, that doesn't necessarily mean they can't transition. Many people with that make fantastic women and it does help them. But it's a complication. If someone has autism, that's a complication. If someone has a mood disorder, that's a complication. And the problem is, and this is going to be really unpopular, so many of these therapists are so progressively captured that, as Taff has said a billion times, they are so overly affirming that they will not truly interrogate any of these forces. And I think the reason the trans community is so chaotic and destructive and neurotic today is a lot of people have been like ushered down this medical pipeline who it is not serving.
I have a perhaps overly candid follow-up question there. Nothing made me feel more like a woman and more in touch with what I view as the essence of womanhood than breastfeeding. Breastfeeding my son, to clarify. I feel like both being pregnant and giving birth, breastfeeding, these are things that not all women necessarily go through, but to me at least, there was this extreme sense of clarity as to what my purpose on this earth and as a woman is. How do you, Brianna, look at that cluster of issues? Like, do you feel longing? Do you feel sadness? How did that play into your sort of, self-conception of yourself as a woman?
It's very hard, Liz. The older I've gotten, the more I long for children. I am not
Do you
too
have
ashamed to
children?
admit I
No.
don't. I
Okay.
don't. I've there's a school near my house, and I've seen like the line of moms picking up their kids, and sometimes it makes me want to cry because it's just something I
Yeah.
can't do. I have to make my peace with that, and a way I try to channel it is to mother younger women in their careers as best as I can and to, try to be a leader and help younger women. But it hurts to be really honest with you. I've heard many women say that they feel that, being a woman is primarily biological, and I think that probably makes a lot of sense. For me, I experience being a woman with a set of behaviors and a mindset and a kind of softness by the way I try to approach the world that feels much more natural to me than being a man did.
What does that entail?
What does that entail?
Yeah, like,
Uh,
what does that feel like? What does that look like? I'm curious.
I remember when I was living as a man, it was so much more like conflict, stating your opinion, not leaving people room to talk. Exact can testify to this. There's a kind of hierarchy that's established in all male groups that's just exhausting with the pecking order. This kind of feeling of everyone's feelings are going to be considered, the point of the group is to come to consensus. There's just a set of behaviors there that just feel much more natural to me.
Does it feel ever, especially you're talking about how so frequently women will talk about the thing that I'm describing, right? The sense of like breastfeeding made me feel it was very much part of what I was put on this earth to do. Do you ever feel like among biological women you're on the outside looking in?
Of course I do. I mean, look, I'm a trans woman. Ultimately, I am a cheap, surgically hacked together Target knockoff version of a woman. I just am. I mean, it's sad and it makes me wanna cry, but this is my fate, and as pathetic as it is, this is literally the best life I'm ever gonna have for myself. Like, I've tried it the other way, so at some point, I just have to accept that and try to nourish those parts of myself in different ways. What frustrates me is this biological denialism that's happening in progressive spaces telling you, Liz, that that experience doesn't matter when it's just a lie. I think most women
Yeah.
with children feel that way.
Yeah.
So I think I just have to accept that I can have some experiences, but I can't have all of them. And
That
it's
makes
tragic, but there it is.
that makes a lot of sense. Don't worry, God loves you and Twitter loves you, perhaps more importantly.
I wanted
You
to
are
ask,
not pathetic.
I wanted to ask TafTaj about your experience because in preparing for this, I saw a video that you made a couple years ago where you were expressing some regrets about your transition. I'd like to just play a short clip from that and then ask a follow up. John, could you roll that, please?
When I interact with doctors, there's very much this prevailing sense that, well, if you just like transition, you'll be okay. And that wasn't the case. Like, transition was not what I needed in that moment. What I needed was for a doctor to be like, no, wait, and don't transition now. And, try to like integrate as like a normal person. And obviously, like, I don't know if I would have believed them. I probably wouldn't have believed them at the time. But like, if they could somehow like beam my current knowledge into my brain as a 15-year-old or as a 14-year-old, then I think that would have really benefited me. And I don't know if there's like a way for them to have done that, but like in an ideal world, there would have definitely been like a lot more patience with starting transition.
So that was 2 years ago. Do you still feel that way?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And Brianna, you and I, we transitioned at different times in the world, and I think that by the time that I was transitioning, so I transitioned when I was 14. I'm 24 now, and already at that time, there was, I think there were a lot of myths about what transition would be like, right? And so I bought into an idea, a vision of transition, which kind of placed transition as a panacea. Like it would fix all the issues that I had. And if I didn't do it, I would probably end up like killing myself, horribly depressed, whatever, right? That was the message that I was getting from the trans community and from a lot of like adults in my life, whether they be like, just progressive people or even, people who are medically minded, right? Who were telling me what it would be like if I did or didn't transition. And I think that that messaging is really destructive. I think that it teaches people to view themselves essentially as fragile and lacking in agency. And, I think that a lot of the messaging is you just need to transition harder. That'll make you happy. I will say being able to wear the clothes that I wanna wear and, wear makeup and everything that I like, that is important. That's a very important core human experience to feel like you have agency in how you present yourself. But is that the end all be all of what it takes to be happy and successful? No. And can I survive even if people, don't see me as a woman or, if I'm not able to have children? Yes. And so I think having to develop that sense of resilience, like, yes, I am a trans woman, like I am male, but I don't have to necessarily agonize about the gap between me and a cis woman when I can triumph in the act of becoming and
Hmm.
everywhere I've, everywhere I've been.
The argument that you often hear from trans activists who say that puberty blockers should be allowed, that hormone replacement therapy should be allowed when you're 14, 15 years old is that there is, this is shown to be a condition that, especially among boys, once you start to go through puberty, it's gonna affect the outcome. Like you're going to get better aesthetic or, you're going to get better results if you start early. And therefore, we know, therefore, this should be kind of a privately made decision among the individual parents, doctor, and teenager. What do you think of that line of argument, having gone through it yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think every trans woman that I know wishes that she transitioned as a fetus. I mean, every trans woman wishes she transitioned a little bit earlier than she did. And
You're gonna
every
get
trans
pro-lifers, like, religious conservatives so fucking mad with that, right?
well, just because they wish they did doesn't necessarily mean that that's,
But
feasible or
someday the technology might be available,
gonna be there.
right? Like, we're
Yeah,
libertarians, we're dreaming of the future, man.
it's like those moms who, like, they take their 4-year-olds and they're like, "They're trans," and, they dress them up and the kid doesn't even know what trans means. I mean, yeah, so here's gotta reorient a little bit in this. Um, what can you repeat the question again?
Yeah. I was just laying out the argument that you hear as to why transition at a young age for minors should be allowed. And I was curious what you think of the components of that argument.
Yeah, okay, I appreciate that. So, unfortunately, I think the evidence for the benefit of HRT on mental health for adolescents is much weaker than people are actually aware of. And this is something that, I was debating the other side of this once upon a time, and I got into a debate with someone and they just like crushed me. And they were bringing out all of this evidence. And I was looking at it and I was like, oh, this is actually way weaker than I expected. Like, if you dig into these studies, so often you have confounding variables, or you have a non-randomized sample, or you have just like weak kind of survey data where you're not actually getting clinicians in to talk to these people, or you have clinicians talking to people, but it's over a very short time frame, like 3 months, and you see these things and you realize like, oh wait, actually, I had this mental view that transition for minors was extraordinarily robust scientifically and well supported. And it turns out that actually there's so much more research that could be done on this topic. And every time I bring that up to trans people, that, hey, actually, like, when we are banging on this drum about, trans people need to transition, or your minors need to be allowed to transition, otherwise they'll kill themselves. Actually, we don't have good data to suggest that's true. And when we do that, we are setting essentially a trap for ourselves that eventually someone's going to call us on this, or people are going to end up transitioning and detransitioning later. And that's really going to hurt not only them, but also the public perception of transition at large. That's, I think, what's happened is more and more there's been this gap between what the ideology says is happening and reality. And the bigger that gap, the harder the snapback is. And I think that we've seen that with Trump's presidency. We're going to see that more until we get really serious about confronting reality as it is and not how we'd like it to be.
If I could add on to that, one of the beauties of doing Dogcast with Taff is I have two of my co-hosts that transitioned as minors, and then Sky and I did it at the same age, 25. So, it's really interesting to me that getting to know Taff has really shaken me of this delusion I used to have that if I had just transitioned earlier, like all my problems would have been solved because the four of us have a lot of the same insecurities and struggle within. I do have to say, like, for just a difference, and I totally respect where Taff is coming from. For me, I had a total wild drug addiction by 19 from trying to suppress this stuff and not being affirmed as a child. I had a major depressive episode. I did have suicide attempts as a child repeatedly. It was an extraordinarily painful childhood, and I hope you'll put my video talking about this in the show notes. That doesn't mean that the public policy solution is for me to go back and undo this trauma that happened, back in the 90s. What it means is exactly what Taff is saying. We need a more honest conversation, and it is not serving parents to threaten them with this gun that says if you do not affirm your child right away, that they are going to kill themselves. That's not true. And it is also true, exactly as Taft said, the evidence for this is very weak. But the dirty little secret of trans healthcare is all of the research is extraordinarily weak. Go look at this stuff. It is self-reported surveys run by underqualified grad students. The modern ones put all of us into this gender soup where a non-binary person is considered the exact same thing as me and we're not. So, like, the thing is, we need actual science advising public policy on this.
Hmm.
And no one is interested in doing this because you've got the Republicans that are very hostile to the idea of this being healthcare. And then you've got the progressive fringe, which doesn't want honest questions asked. So, our mission, Taff and I's, her from more of the right and mine from more of the left, is we think trans people deserve an honest conversation about every part of this.
Hmm. I want to bring, in the spirit of trying to advance that honest conversation, I want to bring forth some of the data that I think supports what you're laying out there. We had a previous conversation with Jesse Singal about the Cass review, which was a systematic review of the literature that came out of the UK in trying to sort of tweak the policies that the national policies there that go into their national health service and how they approach this issue. You mentioned that there was for a long time a belief that this vastly improved mental health outcomes among minors. That was based on a study out of Amsterdam, which is pictured here in the dark gray bars. The further to the left there, the better the outcome, basically. When they tried to replicate that again in London, they did not get those results, which you can see with the lighter gray bars. And their conclusion at the end of the day was that they put a pause on puberty blockers altogether. They said providing hormones from age 16 could be available on a case by case basis, but it needs to be much stricter. There needs to be a real clear clinical rationale. And the kind of top level takeaway here is that it's an area of remarkably weak evidence. Results of studies are exaggerated or misrepresentative, and we have no good evidence of the long term outcomes. So that all lines up with everything you've been saying.
Yeah.
How influential do you think that this report coming out of the UK is going to be in the big picture?
I do just want to say, like, weak evidence for it helping also means there's not strong evidence that it's harming. And I think that's a
Right.
point that gets roller skated past a lot in this discussion. And I
Mhm.
actually really like that recommendation because it's talking on a case by case basis. So
Mhm.
if you have a child with like 6 out of 6 of those criteria that's been insisting they were a girl since 3 years old, all that stuff that has persistent gender dysphoria before and after puberty, the odds of that going away, according to what we know, are pretty low. So I think like that is a situation where I'd be more apt to listen. But I think extreme caution is exactly the right message there. As far as the Cash report and the impact here, Zach and Liz, let's just be honest with you. You know this like you're at reason. You know this as well as I do. Both the left and the right do not want to listen to any part of this. They've got their minds made up. They are not looking at data. They're not listening to trans people that have actually transitioned because we tend to have more moderate politics on this. And it's just more extremism for lunch. This is not serving the trans community and it is not serving the wider conversation.
Is there an argument, given that level of uncertainty at this point, for sort of taking this out of the realm of the medical somewhat, or like has this become over medicalized to some degree? Like, could we say, hey, adults can kind of do what they want. They have bodily autonomy, and it's a degree of, in terms of the medical system being involved, you're going to have surgeries, but we already have cosmetic surgeries that have nothing to do with a medical need. And we're just going to not have this so entwined with the medical establishment and the bureaucracy. Is there sense to that kind of way of thinking about it?
I understand understand this is a policy people want because it just means I don't have to think about it. It's
Yeah.
very straight. So this is the nuanced position I want to take. Take female to male transsexuals off the table. Testosterone will work just as fine when you're 25 as 50. You're going to look
Mm.
exactly the same. There's no reason to rush into this, particularly given that is the biological girls that are having the vast, overwhelming majority of the detransition issues. I think the complication that you get into with this is I do know people that feel very strongly this served them. I actually have a relative, like I was adopted, so I'm not related to them, who this is, I've seen them grow up and this radically improved their lives. And yeah, for me, it is very difficult to go through life being 6 feet tall. I absolutely hate this. I've had to have my jaw reworked 3 times to be able to pass. And there is a risk to making people like me like go through those kinds of repeated medical surgeries just to have a normal life. So the policy I want is just to radically re-raise the standards, get FTMs off the table, leave this much of a window there for biological boys that feel this way, and make really sure it's there before and after puberty. The regret rate is going to be so low there that I think it's basically going to be a statistical blip in my view.
That
Hmm.
makes a lot of sense. One question that I have for you, Brianna, if you could like back of the envelope math it, like people get so distracted in these conversations by constantly culture warring on both sides of it. But like, do you have a rough sense of like what the total price tag of your entire transition has been? Maybe not the amount that you were billed, but yeah, because I would imagine that doctors to some degree have like an incentive to want to get a whole bunch of money from doing operations over and over again, especially it's maybe more operations than what meets the eye, I think.
Well, first of all, I paid for every cent of my entire transition myself.
Oh,
Like,
really?
that's just the truth,
Okay.
because I did it I did this 20 years ago.
Okay. That
So,
makes sense. But now
um,
there's been a shift to more insurance providers covering more
there
components?
is
Okay.
well, let me walk through this.
Okay.
So, the HRT amount is just negligible, right?
Okay.
It is $30 every month or 2, right? Just not even worth talking about. Anti-androgens a little bit more. If you're talking vaginoplasty, how much is that today? I paid 25 for mine. I'd imagine it's like 40 today, something like yeah, 40. Yeah. Full suite of FFS. I had first gen facial feminization surgery, and then I had it all redone last year. It cost me about $100,000 last year to have all of that redone, again, out of pocket.
Wow.
So, you know, is it expensive? Yes. But, again, I think the cost that it adds to insurance is a rounding error. And no offense to you, Liz, if you really want to look at who's driving up healthcare costs, it is parents and children. Like that is the bulk of the
Oh.
healthcare
Oh,
costs.
completely.
You're-
I think it's
Yeah,
just one I
yeah.
mean, maybe I feel like a good capitalist deep down because one of the arguments that's most persuasive to me as to
Mhm.
like, "Hey, people who are transitioning really mean it. It is a very deeply, authentically felt thing," in part because revealed preferences tell us a lot, and boy, are people willing to put an awful lot of money where their mouths are, and then also the extraordinary hardship of recovering from these highly invasive surgeries, and so, like, at least maybe this is like autism brain or something going or like just libertarian brain, but like that's always been the component where it's like odd to me that that's not emphasized more because I'm like, I don't know, that's an awful lot of money. I don't want to put my body through that. You have to believe this very deeply and feel strongly convinced that this will be a game changer for your life to put, I don't know, 200 grand or more toward it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I do.
A lot of
Look
literal
at why
skin in the game.
Yeah.
Look at why I opened my mouth. It's lopsided because the nerves in one side of my mouth have been killed from
Oh, wow.
FFS, right?
Mm.
Wow.
Hopefully it will come back eventually. But there is a real risk to a lot of these surgeries, right?
Oof.
And again, it's like there's risk to doing stuff and there's a risk to not doing stuff.
Yeah,
And it
that's a
is
really good way of putting it.
so painful. I would not recommend FFS. It's not a fun weekend. Neither is vaginoplasty, I have to say. It's like the public does not know the dirty details of how that works, and I'm far too Southern to go into them here on your show. It
It's
let me
This is the
throw
great omerta of the woman. It's like, we don't talk about vaginas too much. Let's keep it that way. Brianna, you've gotten the memo.
let me throw one more of my libertarian views out there and see what you think of this take. That this is basically a social issue and that the government would do well to kind of leave institutions alone to make decisions about what they accommodate. And that kind of goes on both sides of the ledger, not pushing them to accommodate trans identifying people or push them against doing so. So whether it's, sports leagues, bathrooms, schools, even you can say like district level, prisons is obviously a very difficult one, but putting that aside, like, should this just kind of play out in the social sphere, and should what we be pushing for be to get the government out of tipping the scale towards, how we spa should treat trans people or something?
I'll let Taft take this, but I just want to say a sentence there. You said trans identifying people there, and
Yeah.
I just want to caution you. This is language that the gender critical and turf movement has used to dehumanize us. I'm not trans identified. I'm a
You're
trans
female.
woman. I don't consider myself female. I'm a natal male that is transition. I am a transgender woman, right? I don't mind if you point out that I'm a biological male. That's just accurate. But if you call me trans identifying, that is language designed to, it's political language like calling, anti-choicers, anti-choicers instead of,
Mm.
anti-abortionists or like it's
Okay,
political
fair enough.
language
I take your
to
point. So, how we spa would treat trans women, it might be a better way to phrase it. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Tasha. Jump in.
Yeah, no, I think we're very aligned on this ultimately. I think adults should have a lot of leeway with their bodies, and I agree. I mean, there is a revealed preference in the market. People are clearly willing to spend lots of money to do this, and I think people should have the right to do that. I should have the right to wear what I want to wear, and you should have the right to, not respect my pronouns, right? And say what you wanna say,
Mm.
and you should have the right to date me or not date me, and I think it's best if, corporations have the right to set standards within their workplace. Like if a corporation wants to say, listen, if you're going to be employed here, you have to call trans people by their preferred pronouns. I think that's totally legitimate. And when it comes to like sports leagues and prisons, I think you're really getting to the heart of the issue. Happens as well with medicalization and insurance, where suddenly the government is involved and the government is taking a stance. And if that stance isn't based on evidence, real evidence, and isn't meeting people where they're at, suddenly you're going to have political problems. So, totally agree in an ideal world. And then the rest is just navigating uh, the instances where the government really is involving everyone else in this issue of transness.
I don't think I agree though. Like Taft, this is my problem with that though. So I live in Massachusetts, right? We had the bathroom bill in 2017. I don't need to worry ever about using the restroom there, even though in 20 years no one's ever said anything to me. I do fine, like blending in the real world. But I think that if we are looking for better public policy on all of these trans issues, I do think that the federal government has a role to play in safeguarding this stuff. Someone has got to be the adult in the room and step up to WPATH, which is this healthcare organization that purports to speak for TAF and I, and has just been politically captured by these fringe lunatics that are telling you that like eunuchs are like part of trans when it's a fetish. It's absolutely insane. So
Mm.
I think there is a role to play in smarter public policy and access. And what it looks like to me is less of this California self-ID law that lets a man with a fetish that literally gets sexual arousal from walking into a locker room and showing women his penis. He was able to do that because of the system you're advocating, Taft, which is like going in and filling on a form and saying, I feel like a woman, self-ID. No clinician is involved. I don't think that's safe for women. So I
Well
think like
well,
a real set of
Isn't
one
isn't
thing I'm
tough.
curious about here,
Yeah.
though, Hold on, one thing I'm curious about here though is like, at least from my perspective as a woman, who's also just like physically weaker than many trans women are, depending on where they are in their transition, right? Despite my best efforts to become, a little more jacked, like we're basically relying on the medical establishment to be these very judicious gatekeepers. And I'm sorry, but like, especially after COVID era and especially seeing the number of kids put on puberty blockers, it's not clear to me that we won't have an incredibly ideological group of medical gatekeepers. Like, I'm sorry, but, like, I feel a certain
Trust the
distrust where
science.
it's like, can they actually be good gatekeepers when we don't really have, at least from my perspective, we don't have much evidence to indicate that they have been, that the experts have been, um, worth trusting in the last few years. What do you make of that argument?
I think that's a reasonable argument. I think Taff and I both agree that there's an ideological capture there. I do have to say, like, if you've been on off testosterone for any amount of time, I literally dropped a $3,000 MacBook from the overhead on a flight last week because I was not strong enough to lift my bag up into the overhead.
Well, I'm not
Getting
that
off
weak.
testosterone, sure,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
saying I am not a strong person.
Yeah. That's wild.
Most trans women, like, once you get off this testosterone, our muscle mass just plummets, right? So I hear what you're saying
Hmm.
there, and I think that's fair. I think
Interesting.
standards are the way to go, and I think that I wish that WPATH would work again. It would be the best solution for everyone. An organization on experts on the outside that state legislators can look at to advise them. If that were not captured by the progressive fringe, it'd be amazing.
I just want to
I wanna give I wanna give Zach a chance to talk, and I wanna give Toph a chance to talk, but also, I just wanna say first, like, I really appreciate that both of you guys seem to take the complicated rights balancing very seriously, right?
yeah.
Like, both of you guys are interested in, like, I have rights that I am entitled to, and you guys also have rights that you're entitled to, and so there's a sense of, like, how do we sufficiently balance these things, recognizing when those things rub up against each other? And I think that there's just a level of intellectual rigor that is frankly really refreshing. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and in regard to what Brianna brought up earlier about, like, people going into bathrooms, one of the reasons that I might not explicitly identify as libertarian, despite my obviously libertarian leanings, is I think it's important for there to be some safeguards, but really, for me, that is in making sure that people who are maybe, like, mentally ill or not of sound mind are not doing things with their body that they wouldn't necessarily do if they could make decisions, in perfect rationalism. So I think that a lot of times you have these laissez-faire systems. They work for a certain set of people. They work for people who are cogent and, can clearly see into the future. And then they fail people who aren't able to make those decisions. And so I think the government has some responsibility to make sure that doctors are at least doing like a bare minimum check to make sure we're not predating upon people who are more vulnerable in society. That said, you have this other thing, which is what Brianna's talking about, which is, if someone gets access to HRT, then, does that make them more able to attack women? And I think that, like, maybe. I don't know if it's a big effect, but other things also make you more able to attack people, like owning a gun. That's a big risk in terms of being able to assault people. And yet we accept that that's a personal freedom that's important. And so I think that being able to transition, get access to hormones, and have some businesses be like, yes, on our property, you are allowed to use women's restrooms or all of our restrooms are co-ed, however they want to do it. I think that is ultimately not a very significant risk, but I think it's important that we're aware and, obviously sexual assault's illegal. We should, make sure that we're safeguarding that, so
Or at least let me carry a gun wherever I want to, right?
there you go, yeah.
Thank you for
Equal
bringing that home.
well.
Isn't
Yeah.
this
So
the
We're
problem,
rights
though, that
balancing here. We're doing compromise today.
but Liz, this is the problem, and this is what really frustrates Taff and I, is
Mhm.
the fringe trans movement, the progressive trans movement, with the concern you just brought up. Their message to you has frankly been shut the hell up,
Yeah.
and they want tell you it
Oh,
does
it's
not
been
exist.
worse. It's been wishing
Well,
rape upon
trust
me,
me, I
right?
tell you
Like,
this a lot here.
yeah.
You're right, and A, it's very male coded, let's just
Well,
admit that,
so
but
true.
B, it's like, look, trans women there are competing public policy interests here,
Yeah, there
and
really
there
are.
is a way for you to have your public policy needs heard and addressed and for you to feel safe and for me to have mine addressed. The truth is we're never going to get that on this crazy fringe progressive playbook. It is making Calf and I so much more unsafe what this progressive fringe is doing because it is turning our existence into a culture war. And
Sure.
that is why we started Dollcast, because we recognize if we don't back away from this fringe, it's not the non-binary people that are gonna get hurt. They don't need access to any of this stuff. It's tough enough. So it's long past time for the trans community to have an honest conversation, and that's what we're gonna do.
Let me ask you one last question before we wrap up, which is looking forward because Brianna, you spoke in such a heartfelt way about kind of the struggle of your predicament, how you can only push it so far. What we do know is that that technology has improved over the past couple decades and is likely to continue to improve. I was made aware of this story by Josie Zahner, who is a biohacker extraordinaire, also a trans woman, who told me that there was a woman who gave birth despite most of her cells having XY chromosomes. This is a condition that some women, like biological women, have this condition where they have XY chromosomes, and it usually results in like they might have a kind of underdeveloped uterus and they will not be producing kind of viable eggs. And so in this case, what happened was a patient with these 46 XY chromosomes took place in a specially tailored fertility program and could and maintained a normal pregnancy and delivery of a baby girl. And this involved IVF being implanted into her uterus, which was an actual functioning uterus. That's the big, you know, physiological leap for trans women. It's like, will uterine implants ever be viable? But like, I guess just thinking about that, like how much do you expect technology, particularly advances in biotech, to change the conversation in the
Oh
coming
my
few
goodness.
years?
I mean, I think anyone can look at a picture of what I looked about 5 years ago and look what I look like today with, the modern FFS techniques. It's a big difference. So, all this stuff is getting, a lot better. I do wanna say, I think that, childbirth is probably not the biggest problem that the trans community is facing. I think more of us, having enough drive to go get jobs would be one of the first things I would suggest. With the, criteria for transitioning, when I did this 20 years ago, she actually had to be able to hold down a job to get vaginoplasty, which has been removed. I think, I look forward to this technology. I would love to have it, but I don't think trans women are ready have to be doing this stuff yet. We got some work to do.
I
Yeah.
wanna ask you guys the final question of the show that we pose to all of our guests, and I want to go to Toph first since, she hasn't gotten quite as much speaking time, but I want both of you guys to answer it. What's one question that you guys think more people ought to be asking?
That's a good question. Um, I think it's really important that you ask what is valuable to you, what your actual values are. And I think it's important you determine that because more than anything else, knowing what you believe in and staying true to that will be the best guide that you could have.
Mine would be very similar. I think it's really, really important for you to be able to explain the, argument for the other side. I think that one of the biggest problems, that's just grown since the advent of Facebook is everyone's in their own world and no one is talking to each other. I think you need to be able to understand the people that you're fighting, or you can't like make a cogent public policy argument. I think the Democrats learned this, probably actually didn't learn this the very hard way in the last few weeks.
So
Totally
true. Thank
agree.
you.
And
Thank you both
yeah,
for your candor and for speaking with us. This was super enlightening. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you so
I'm
much.
such a huge fan of your work, Liz.
I know.
It's like
It's awesome.
thank you both.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. We drop a new episode every Thursday, so if you want to support the work we do, please like and share this episode, subscribe to our new YouTube channel, and follow the show on your favorite podcasting app. See you next time.